If you're sitting down to buy a rowing machine, you're most likely looking at number one, price. Obviously, start there. But number two, there's a big category that you may be overlooking that's actually incredibly important because they have a lot of pros and cons to any sides of these decisions, and that's the type of resistance on the machine you're considering. There are 4 primary types of resistance when it comes to rowing machines. Each has their benefits, each has their downsides. Which is right for you? Let's talk about that today. So there are 4 primary types of resistance on rowing machines currently. Now, are there others that are worth discussing in the past and on higher end machines? Yeah, but they're outliers. So let's talk about the 4 primary ones. With the 4 primary, you have hydraulic, magnetic or electromagnetic, water, and air. So those are your 4 real types that you need to consider. And again, each of them has a pretty decent pro and con list that you should really be looking at, because you might choose the resistance types that's right for you, and then you can go about hunting all the different machines and what price ranges you have available to you. So let's just dive right into the first of these, and we'll start to understand what's the right decision for you based off of your needs. If this is your first time here, welcome. I'm Shane Farmer, and this is Dark Horse, where you build the life that you want to live, and we just happen to use rowing to help you get there. Now, the first of these machine types, hydraulic. Now, where we get at with hydraulic is generally you have the lowest priced option. So you can find some very, very inexpensive rowing machines with hydraulic resistance, and that's in the pro category. Bing! Let's put that right there. First on that list, price. You can probably find some pretty inexpensive machines when they are hydraulic. Number 2, they're pretty quiet. There's not a whole lot of mechanical noise happening when you use a hydraulic machine, so put that under the pro category under ding, quiet. Number 3 is that they are generally compact. They don't take up a lot of space because they're pretty small machines, and that also plays to their favor because they can fit in very tight, small spaces. Go ahead and bing, put that in the pro category. And then number 4, there's probably a little bit of nostalgia there. I don't know about you, but my grandparents, when I was young, had one in their spare bedroom. I don't know that I ever saw anybody work out on that thing, but I swear all of our grandparents had them. The rowing machine must have seen like a surge in the 60s when hydraulic rowing machine emulators came out. So I remember getting on one of those when I was a kid, and I didn't know a thing about rowing. I just jumped on the machine and went back and forth on that thing. So there's a bit of nostalgia. Let's throw that under the pro category as well. Now, on the con side, when it comes to a hydraulic machine, number 1, you have the potential for these pistons to overheat, and I have firsthand experienced that. Now, granted, in a past video, I went and bought a used Tunturi, which was an ancient machine, and those pistons got hot real fast. They also dripped oil. I'm sure most modern machines have gotten over those issues. Number 2 on the con side is that you're generally not going to collect any data. Most of these don't have any useful data coming in through any kind of a monitor. Maybe there's a time function, and frankly, that's probably it. Most of them aren't measuring any kind of wattage or output because there's not a whole lot of accuracy that comes from the. Number 3 on the con list, you're not actually emulating the rowing stroke, and that's probably my biggest knock of most piston-driven machines. They just don't take you through the rowing stroke. They get this weird bit. It's more like the closest I could relate it to is like a rowboat, like a fixed seat rowboat in a big open lake where you're like doing this thing. So maybe you're emulating rowboats, but real rowing is a leg with a sliding seat. It's a big leg push, and that's where so much of the value of rowing comes from, is in its movement. So odds are you're not actually getting the benefits of rowing. So that's a con. And the final con with a hydraulic machine is you probably can't adjust the resistance. Maybe you can a little bit, but there's no real way to create consistency with that changeover in resistance if you're able to. There's probably no measurement when it comes to it. So again, you're getting resistance. Am I gonna knock somebody who buys this machine for price because that's all that matters and they start moving? 100% not. But if we're evaluating these from pros and cons, the fact that you can't adjust resistance, definitely a con. Next up, let's talk about magnetic resistance. Now, with magnetic resistance, there's a bit of a split here because you have magnetic, manual magnetic, and electromagnetic. And for the purposes of today's video, let's call it EMR. That just sounds fun. So EMR and manual magnetic. Now, both are going to create resistance in essentially the same way, in that magnets are going to create the resistance of what is probably still a flywheel inside of the machine. But The difference with a magnetic is that you're generally going to use some kind of manual adjustment, like a turn of a knob or something, to bring magnets closer together, which creates more resistance on the flywheel, which creates a heavier feeling. Or you turn it the other way, they get further apart, which means that they don't have as strong of a pull to each other, and that is going to create less resistance. On the electromagnetic side, it's probably computer controlled, and that resistance changes by driving current through the magnets to make them stronger or weaker, so that you can adjust the resistance on the machine. So it's important just to understand how those things work, because some of that plays into the pro and the con of magnetic resistance. Just a quick primer on the electromagnetic side. Essentially, think of the magnets at their weakest as like a magnet on a refrigerator, and at their heaviest, the magnet that picks up a car in a junkyard and like moves it across, and Nicolas Cage is trapped inside of it, or his younger brother, and he gets trapped into the crunching machine, and everybody's screaming at each other, and it's all because of that magnet. That's what we're talking about with rowing machines here, Nicolas Cage movies. So when you get to that adjustment, that electromagnetic piece, you're going to send current. The higher the current, the more the resistance. The lower the current, the less the resistance. Now let's get to the pros and the cons of magnetic resistance. I'm going to generally lump the pros of both manual and electromagnetic together, just for easier sake of evaluation. Now, with electromagnetic resistance, you get faster adjustment. It can be a little bit easier for you to just boop, 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 touch the screen of the machine you're on and watch the machine change the resistance for you, because again, it's you're plugged in somewhere. So you've got current going. You just go, give me that heavier. And it goes, all right, more current, heavier. And that's what you generally feel. So you get faster adjustment of your resistance when you do that. The second benefit or pro to a magnetic resistance or electromagnetic resistance is it's very quiet. And this may in fact be the quietest of machines, because there is essentially nothing mechanical happening. So you don't have that mechanical noise that's going, like a flywheel spinning or water splashing or pistons going. It's just very quiet. You get the resistance. End of story. There you go. So it's a quiet machine. Next up, you're going to get greater range. And this is because you can essentially turn the magnets off, so they're completely ineffective, or you can make them really heavy. And so you get this broader range, higher highs, lower lows, and everything in between. And that gives you a lot of resistance opportunities inside the machine. And so there's a benefit too. You have more range of opportunity. Now with that range as well comes the next pro, which is that you can get more dynamic workouts because of that. And especially if it's EMR, electromagnetic, then you're going to be able to perhaps get more dynamic workouts inside of the workout, meaning maybe the machine is able to adjust resistance for you in the middle of the workout based off of what you're doing. For example, you take your stroke rate up, well, maybe that sends a signal to the computer to lighten the resistance, because that's what actually happens on water. You take more strokes, well, each stroke feels a little bit lighter. You slow the stroke rate down, ooh, it gets heavier because you get more load on it in rowing. The oar moves through that. These are oars, in case that wasn't the parent. So that's what you get then when you get that more dynamic range, is maybe it can be more creative in the way that your workouts are displayed. And finally, typically a magnetic resistance machine is not going to have as much maintenance, because it's just a fairly simple system. Now, I want to put an asterisk on that one, because you're probably going to see a divergence there on the manual magnetic and electromagnetic. On an electromagnetic, you have computers, you have a lot more happening inside, which just increases the chances for failure of something. So I don't know, maybe that goes in both categories, pro and con, which leads me into the cons of magnetic resistance. Number one, price, especially electromagnetic when it comes to that. Now, if you have a manual magnetic, you're probably going to still be able to find more reasonably priced, but EMR, I'm kind of sticking with that as what we're discussing here. It's going to be more expensive, and that's because there's more that has to go into the system to build it. So generally, cost is going to go up once you get into the electromagnetic resistance side. Another con is the fact that it's a bit of a black box as to what's happening. Now, yes, I fundamentally explained what's going on in there, but when I say black box, it's more like you're not going to be able to get your hands in there to really work on it if something goes wrong. Whereas a more mechanical machine generally is going to be using simpler parts that you might be able to do repairs on yourself. And so there's a value that goes to that as well. So that black box piece can be considered a con too.
Next up on the con side is that you have to be connected to power, which means that you need to be somewhere within reach of an outlet. Otherwise, you're not going to be getting any resistance on the machine or adjustability on the machine. Again, that goes for EMR, not manual. But that being said, to me, that's a downside. I don't really love the idea that I have to have an extension cord running somewhere across my garage so that I can have enough power to power my machine just so that I can get a workout. And finally, you may not get as realistic of a feel with magnetic resistance. So some companies are going to argue that it creates a very realistic feel because they're able to create the adjustment, but I'd argue that magnetic resistance just doesn't quite land the same. So if you're looking for that feel of real rowing, you might not actually get that when it comes to EMR. Next up, the water resistance category, of which there are actually quite a few machines that fall in this area. You have different companies that put their tanks in different orientations, but at the end of the day, what you get is a tank of water with a flywheel or a blade that sits in the water, and that blade spins and pushes the water around, and that's where you get your resistance from. So on the pro side, it sounds beautiful. Just the whoosh of water, it puts you into the mindset of rowing, and you get that sloshing. It's like, it's almost meditative. And I gotta admit, I do enjoy the sound of a water-based rowing machine. So that's definitely a pro for me. Number two, they're generally pretty good looking. That water is also very soothing to see. And so you get this visual aesthetic that comes with water that you can't get with a mechanical machine. So I definitely put that under the pro category as well. Another pro is that these are quiet as well. Because you're getting that whoosh, it's kind of hard to make a whoosh so loud that you upset people or your neighbors through your apartment wall. So when you're looking for a quiet machine, water-based machines are a good way to fit into that category, is because you both get that beautiful sound and it also isn't so loud that it bothers people around you. And of course, when it comes to water, you're getting a bit more of a realistic water feel. Now, some rowers would argue that a water-based rowing machine doesn't feel like rowing on the water, but if you've never rowed on the water, do you really know the difference? No, you're getting just a bit more unique of a feel and more unique of an experience with water in your machine. And many people cherish and love that feeling of the flywheel moving through water. It's just very earthy, I guess, is the best way that I can put that. It's real water. It's a thing. It's an element. And you're moving and working with that element. So there's a piece of that just feels very real and tangible. And to that, I gotta give water-based rowing machines credit. Now, on the con side for water-based rowing machines, number one with that comes the inability to really adjust resistance easily. Now, I have seen some mechanisms and ways, like you open a chute and some water drains out, and so it does change resistance a little, but for the most part, water-based rowing machines don't have a whole lot of adjustability in their resistance levels. They use more of the argument of your effort changes the resistance of the machine. It's up to you to create the resistance change. I would say that's kind of the argument for most water-based rowing machines. I'm just saying you can't just boom, flip a lever and all of a sudden it feels heavier or lighter for you to play with. Another con on this category is the cleanliness factor. It's pretty manual. So if you wanted to adjust resistance, for example, you would have to use a pump to get water out, as well as the cleanliness factor. You got to make sure you keep chlorine tablets in there so that the water doesn't go bad and the water stays clean, and it may be occasionally you have to top off the water again. I would call that a con just because that's an increased maintenance factor that you don't have with some of the other machines. Now, as you get into the water side as well, price definitely starts to go up, and that's just because, again, these machines have to be built with greater engineering to house the water that's in there and making them look pretty. Many of them use higher end materials, so cost is generally going to go up once you see a water-based rowing machine, but I've also seen some inexpensive ones out there. I'm just generally going to kind of put cost in the con category of the water rower. So does water resistance tickle your fancy? Well, hold on, because we're getting into air, which is probably with water one of the other most common resistance factor that you're going to find. Now, the air category when it comes to resistance is a simple flywheel. Usually there's a mechanism for closing off or opening up air supply into the machine, or it's actually not so much air supply as it is the ability for air to move in and out of the housing around the flywheel. Once you introduce that housing, it allows allows you to create different resistance levels, and that is how the resistance is altered. So generally on the side or the top of these machines, you just adjust a little adjusting guy, and that's going to change the amount of air that moves into and out of the housing, which is going to hold the flywheel. And generally, that housing does a couple things. Number one, it saves little fingers from getting stuck in a really fast fan blade. And the other is that it allows you and gives you that adjustability or that variability of resistance on the machine. So let's talk about the pros and cons that come with air. Now, on the pro side, number one, because they're mechanical, it means that they are going to be a little bit easier to work on. Generally, the parts are easier to come by. You might be more comfortable working on it if something needs to be repaired. And so it's pretty simple to get into them. There's not a whole lot of confusing stuff going on. And often they're built to be repaired manually on your own with simple parts. So you set yourself up for future proofing, not having to do a lot of maintenance that's unreasonable. Next up on the pro category, they're smooth. They generally move pretty well. They're not very clunky unless you get really old machines, but a well-maintained air resistance machine is going to feel pretty smooth. And so, boom, beep, boop. That's one bullet, and then boop, it gives you a bit of a realistic spin up and spin down, just like you would in a boat, where you take a stroke, you create momentum, you fly it out for a second, and then things start to slow down. You bring your way back up, you gotta pick it up, it's heavy, lightens, and then you send it off. So you get this kind of undulating effect, and that comes with a real flywheel. You get that same effect that happens, and so you get this kind of realistic up and down, this waviness that comes with the resistance level. So it's both smooth and it feels pretty realistic. They're also pretty price reasonable. Most flywheel-based machines or air flywheel-based machines are going to be reasonably priced. They're gonna not fall into a category that gets outrageously expensive. You're going to be able to procure one at a reasonable price for the most part, because there's nothing inherently super expensive about it. The parts are easier to come by. It's not gonna cost a lot for whoever's making it to do that. And so you can find, middle of the road down to bargain basement prices on air-based resistance machines. And finally, the resistance levels, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but they're just very adjustable. You don't quite get the range of electromagnetic, but you do get decent range of light to heavy resistance, which gives you a number of different factors for your workouts. And that's probably where the variability piece and the usability piece of these come in, is that depending on what you want to accomplish, maybe you want really quick, high heart rate sprint work, but you want it to be light and quick and twitchy. Or you want it to be more strength-based and heavier, and you want a lot of resistance. Well, you can do that with an air-based resistance machine. Now, on to the con category when it comes to air-based resistance. They get dirty. Frankly, they pick up a lot of dirt from the air and the surrounding area, and so they require a healthy amount of maintenance that may not come from an enclosed system where you don't get a lot of that dirtiness. In many of these machines, you have to get in there, there's a chain, you gotta open it up and vacuum it and dust it, and then that can actually have an impact on the performance of the machine, which many people don't know. But that regular maintenance is required, so you do need to have a maintenance schedule in mind when you buy an air resistance machine. Now, another in the con category is that they're known for being noisy because of how mechanical they are. So what happens is that because you have chains and cogs and a flywheel and they're plastic parts and it just isn't a quiet machine. So you need to take into consideration, if you need that quiet in your workout space, well, then maybe an air resistance machine isn't the right one for you. And the final con on the air resistance side is that they're actually impacted quite a bit by external factors, humidity, altitude, dirt. All of those things impact the performance of the machine, and so it's important that you understand keeping your machine clean is important. Taking note of your drag factor and always using a drag factor versus a damper setting so that you get accurate, consistent performance on your machine at all times. There's gonna be that element to it. And also, many people don't pay attention to that. And so you might get on the same brand machine at altitude and at sea level, and you're like, wow, I am just feeling off today. Well, actually, you're probably not off. It's probably the machine, rarely do we get to say that it's the external factor, but in all honesty, it can be. And if the machine is really dirty, has never been cleaned, you're gonna experience the same thing where you see decreased performance from the machine because of that. So my question to you is, what's the right solution for you? I wanna know in the comments below. It's actually interesting to see what kind of machines people gravitate to and why. And maybe your discussion point will help somebody else make that decision for themselves, because at the end of the day, there are a lot of factors that go into this. And I've done videos on how to decide what machine to purchase, but sometimes it's nice to look at it from one, like apples to apples, resistance-based factors, and what are the values of each in your life. And as you go along in this journey, you're gonna need to make sure that you know what you're doing, and when you get your machine, you get the most out of it. So for that, hit that subscribe button and the bell next to it, because then you're gonna get alerted with all of the new videos that are gonna help you get the most out of your rowing machine. And then while you're at it, when you need workouts, because you're gonna need those, check out our beginner playlist right here. Workouts that are going to help you get started, gonna give you all the training that you need until you're ready to step it up and come join us in the crew, linked in the description below.